Hey everyone. I was watching Anime Abandoned, and I watched actually two of Bennett's reviews based on fighting games. The only problem about some of these fighting games is they were only exclusive either in Japan only, and then later on here in the US, via systems like the Neo-Geo, or even Japan-wise, the PlayStation. And those animes that were based on fighting games that he was talking about were Voltage Fighter Go Kaiser and The Art of Fighting. Now, he brought up the fact that even though maybe Voltage Fighter was probably known a little bit better than Art of Fighting, which did go on to be, I think, King of Fighters or something like that, that no one really knew about them unless you probably played them in the arcade. And even if you didn't play them in the arcade, you probably didn't know about them. You probably didn't know about them at all, and you probably didn't even know they had been ported to home console, as well. So I guess that brings me to the topic of this video, and that is, in the 90s, when you had the console wars going on, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis going at it. Why in the early to mid 90s did systems like the 3DO and mostly the Neo-Geo feel that they had to outdo Sega and Nintendo? Here's what I mean. We all know that Sega and Nintendo offered 16-bit graphics, and sometimes even beyond that, which was surprising. We know that the Jaguar tried everything it could from Atari to try to say, hey, we're still better. We got a 64-bit system, and that blew up in their face. So the question obviously is, even in the 90s, why was the Neo-Geo and even the 3DO more expensive than Nintendo and Genesis, Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis? Why were they more expensive? Well, looking up on Wikipedia, the debut price for the Neo-Geo, and I'm pretty sure the 3DO probably falls into the same category, hey. And again, like I said, I'm pretty sure the Neo-Geo falls in the same category. When the Neo-Geo was going to debut originally here in the U.S., the price range for it at first was $599. In other words, $600 right off the bat. Now, according to this, it would include 2 controllers and a game, either Baseball Stars Professional or 1975. However, before it even got here, according to Wikipedia, the price was raised, and the American launch debuted the Neo-Geo system, the Neo-Geo AES system, as the gold system at $649.99. In other words, $650, which today, according to Wikipedia, is the equivalent of $1,000 here in 2000. Well, at the time they printed this, in 2015. So basically now, 2016 be the equivalent of $1,000. Now, it said that later on the gold system of the Neo-Geo AES was bundled with Magician Lord and Fatal Fury. The silver system package, which was about $250 less, only had one control stick and no game. And speaking of the games, they were about $200 and up at launch. In other words, you're looking at nowadays a game that even back then would be about $39, $49, $59, $60 at the lowest. And yet they were asking for their cartridge games, for the AES, their cartridge games, for about $200. And you wonder why. Well, quite simple. Well, quite simple. I'm trying to look here. Trying to see here. The cartridge measures about 7.5. This is according to Wikipedia, and 190 millimeters by 5.34 inches, 136 millimeters. In other words, the reason the Neo-Geo and its games cost so much, and I'm pretty sure, again, this goes for the 3DO, was mostly at the time they were in that time frame, like bringing an arcade home. Basically, that's why the cartridges was so much. That's why the system, that's why the cartridges or the CDs, whatever you want to call it, that's why they were so much. Because basically, in the case of something like the Neo-Geo, they cost the way they did because it was like you were playing an actual arcade game at home. The cartridge itself contained basically what you saw in the arcade. Nothing really changed. The graphics weren't, trimmed, weren't dimmed down or anything. It was basically what you played in the arcade. The only difference was you were playing it at home, but the biggest takeaway was you had to pay about $200 for it, if not more. And a lot of people look at that and say, why? Why would Neo-Geo, why would SNK even do that? Why couldn't they just bring out maybe a 16-bit system or a 32-bit system, cartridge-wise, do something that Sega was supposed to do, which they did later on, and go with that? Why couldn't they just do that? Or why couldn't they do what Atari had proclaimed they had done with the Jaguar and show that it can be done? And have it at a price range of what people can afford? Well, because apparently, I guess SNK was either strapped for money, or the fact that they wanted to show that, hey, even back then, 500 may have not seemed as much, but but here's the thing, and I think this is what they were betting on: layaways. Layaways were always a popular thing, and they still are to this day, mostly during the holidays. They were probably hoping on layaways to be part of their foundation, so that they can have people lay away the system for the kids or for the family, and when they finally got it out, all that money that got laid away, they would get a part of that profit. The point is, even with that said, not a lot of people wanted to do it, but yet, not a lot. What I'm trying to say is, not a lot of people bought the system. They didn't buy the gold system, but they did buy the silver system. So that's how the Neo-Geo, in my opinion, was able to survive. People survive. People are like, we'll just buy the Neo-Geo silver system, rent a game here and there, and be done with it. But the question is, why was it so expensive? Why in the early to mid 90s was the Neo-Geo and the 3DO so expensive? It's because basically they were trying to offer families and households an opportunity to have actual arcade games, no graphics, depleted, trimmed down or whatever, but have the actual arcade game in their home. The only problem is you would have to pay near $1,000, almost close to $1,000 just to get it. Yeah. I mean, what they're saying here is if you got the silver system back then, you'd still have to pay about almost $600 just to have a game to go with your console. It's really stupid. I mean, even Nintendo and Sega realize, hey, if we're going to sell these and become a success, we got to put it at a price range people can afford. Not at a price range which is, you know, out of people's price range, period. I mean, nowadays, it's not a big deal. Nowadays, systems are equivalent at their price ranges of what they would have been back then. So, buying a near $350 system in the PS4 is the equivalent of buying a $150 system like the Super Nintendo. That's what it is. And I think you know, nowadays it's like if Neo-Geo did this now and SNK did this now, it's like Wikipedia said, they'd pay the equivalent of $1,000. But my point is, and I know I sound like I'm rambling, my point is this: the reason the SNK Neo-Geo, its successor, the Neo-Geo CD, and even the 3DO falls into this category because it was price ranged at $799. The reason they were so high is because basically you were paying for an actual arcade cabinet in home console version. That's why. You were paying for a system that gave you arcade graphics just as you saw in the arcade. Well, exactly the same thing you played in the arcade, but now you were playing at home. That's why the Neo-Geo, that's why the 3DO back in the early to mid 90s cost as much as they did. So, hopefully that answered any questions people might still have about it from my perspective. Let me know what you guys think down below, and I'll talk to y'all later.